You were taught that words describe reality, that they are labels for things that already exist, that they come after experience. But that is not how reality actually works. Words come first, not as sound, not as language, but as decision. Every word you speak is a choice about which version of reality continues and which one quietly dissolves. And the reason most people feel stuck is not because they are blocked, unlucky, or doing something wrong. It is because they are loyal to words they have never questioned. This is not metaphor, it is not motivation, it is not about positive thinking. This is about a law that has always existed, long before self-help, long before psychology, long before modern spirituality tried to soften it into something comfortable. Words do not decorate your life, they govern it. They act as silent agreements between you and the unseen structure that responds to declaration. And whether you are aware of it or not, you are renewing those agreements every single day. Most people think reality responds to effort, or intention, or desire. But reality responds to something far more precise. It responds to what you consistently name, what you call yourself, what you call your situation, what you call what is possible for you. Naming is not neutral. In every ancient tradition, to name a thing was to fix its role, its boundary, its permission. When something was named, it was no longer potential, it was assigned. This is why words matter more than emotion. Emotion rises and falls, thought changes, but words harden, words crystallize, words are repeated, and repetition is how reality learns what you are willing to live with. You may not realize it, but most of your language is not observational, it is contractual. When you say, "I'm trying," you are not describing effort. You are defining the ceiling of the outcome. When you say, "I need," you are not expressing desire. You are declaring lack as a condition that must remain true. When you say, "This always happens to me," you are not venting. You are reinforcing a pattern and giving it permission to continue. Reality does not challenge your language, it assumes consent. This is why so many people feel as though life keeps answering the wrong question. They are asking for change with their intentions, but they are confirming the old pattern with their words. And reality, being precise, responds to what is consistent, not to what is hoped for. At some point in human history, speech was not casual, it was deliberate. Words were spoken slowly, titles were chosen carefully. Names were changed only during moments of initiation. Vows were not symbolic, they were binding. To speak was to commit. And silence was understood as power, not absence. Over time, language became fast, unconscious, filler-heavy. Words lost their weight. People began speaking constantly without listening to what they were actually authorizing. And as that happened, responsibility shifted outward. Fate, circumstances, timing, other people. But the mechanism never disappeared, only the awareness did. Here is the part most people miss. Reality does not punish careless language, it fulfills it. If you speak in limitation, reality organizes itself around that limitation. If you speak in postponement, reality delays. If you speak in uncertainty, reality mirrors uncertainty back to you as experience. Not because you are being tested, not because you are unworthy, but because declaration is how direction is set. And this is why positive thinking rarely works, because positivity is emotional, not authoritative. It is often layered on top of language that still declares struggle, delay, and insufficiency. You cannot override a contract with a mood. Reality follows the terms you repeat, not the feelings you visit occasionally. You do not need to speak more. You need to speak less, with more precision. Every sentence you say is quietly answering a question. Is this the version of reality I consent to continuing? Most people answer yes without realizing they are answering at all. And once you see this, you cannot unsee it, because you will begin to notice how often your own words contradict the life you say you want. This is not about fear. It is not about walking on eggshells. It is not about policing every sentence. It is about remembering that speech is not filler. It is selection. It is orientation. It is alignment. Words do not create reality in a dramatic, cinematic way. They create it through permission, through allowance, through what you repeatedly say is normal, acceptable, inevitable, or just how things are. And here is the quiet truth beneath everything you are about to hear next. You are not bound by your past words. You are only bound by the ones you continue to repeat. The moment language becomes conscious, it becomes sovereign. The moment it becomes sovereign, reality begins to reorganize. This transmission is not here to teach you something new. It is here to return weight to something you have been using lightly, because once words regain their weight, life regains its responsiveness. And from this point forward, nothing you say will feel accidental again. Before there were systems, before belief, before ritual, there was naming, not naming as language, but naming as recognition. In every wisdom tradition that understood creation as a living process, to name something was to draw it out of potential and into form, not permanently, not rigidly, but directionally. Naming was how the unseen was invited to take shape. This is why names were never chosen casually. A name was not a label, it was an assignment. It described not only what something was, but what it was allowed to become. When something was named, it was given a role in the greater pattern, and when it was renamed, its role changed. You can see this echoed everywhere once you know how to look. In myth, names are revealed only after trials. In spiritual initiation, a new name is given to mark a shift in identity. In scripture, renaming signals transformation. Abram becomes Abraham. Jacob becomes Israel. Not because the past is erased, but because the future is redirected. Naming is a spiritual act because it defines relationship. When you name something, you decide how you will meet it. When you name yourself, you decide how reality will meet you. Most people believe naming happens after experience, that life occurs first and then we talk about it. But in subtle ways, the order is reversed. What you name becomes the frame through which experience is interpreted, repeated, and reinforced. And once a frame is established, reality rarely contradicts it. This is why two people can live through the same circumstance and emerge into entirely different lives. One names it as a wound, another names it as an initiation, one names it as proof of limitation, another names it as a turning point. And reality responds accordingly, not because one interpretation is more positive, but because each interpretation authorizes a different trajectory. The law here is simple but uncompromising. What is named is organized. What is unnamed remains fluid. And what is repeatedly named becomes stable. This is why language has such quiet power. It is not dramatic, it is accumulative. Every time you repeat a description, it gains weight. Every time you reinforce a story, it becomes easier for reality to agree with it. And over time, what began as a momentary description hardens into identity. You may think you are simply being honest when you say things like, "I'm bad at this," or "That's just how I am," or "This always happens to me." But honesty is not neutrality. Honesty, when repeated without awareness, becomes architecture. It builds walls you then forget you constructed. There is a reason ancient teachings warned against careless speech. Not because words were dangerous, but because they were binding. Speech was understood as something that set forces in motion. Once spoken, it did not disappear. It echoed, it carried instruction, and it invited response. Modern language has lost that reverence. Words are thrown away, stacked on top of one another, used to fill silence, soften discomfort, or avoid presence. But the unseen structure that responds to language never stopped listening. Only humans stopped listening to themselves. This is where most people misunderstand spiritual creation. They believe reality is shaped by belief alone, or by emotion, or by visualization. But belief without language has no edge. Emotion without language dissipates. Visualization without naming fades. It is language that gives these inner states contour. Words act like borders. They say, "This is where possibility ends," or "This is where it begins." When you say "I am," you are not describing a moment. You are naming a state. When you say "I can't," you are not expressing difficulty. You are drawing a boundary. When you say "I need," you are not clarifying desire. You are defining absence as a condition that must remain true for the sentence to make sense. Reality is not confused by this, it responds precisely. This is why people often feel betrayed by life. They believe they are asking for one thing, while their language is confirming another. They say they want freedom, but they speak obligation. They say they want abundance, but they speak shortage. They say they want peace, but they speak urgency, conflict, and self-judgment. And reality, always consistent, continues the pattern that has been named most clearly. There is nothing moral about this, no punishment, no reward, only coherence. The unseen structure seeks alignment, not justice. It aligns with what is stated, not with what is secretly hoped. This is why silence has always been considered sacred. Silence does not reinforce a frame. Silence leaves space. Silence allows reorientation. And this is also why deliberate speech was once rare and intentional. To speak was to commit to a direction. When you understand this, you begin to see how often your own words are closing doors you believe are still open. Not because you are wrong to speak honestly, but because honesty without awareness becomes a vow. A vow does not require witnesses, it requires repetition. And here is the part that most people resist at first, because it feels confronting. Reality does not differentiate between words spoken about yourself and words spoken about your life. When you say, "This is hard," or "This is exhausting," or "This is overwhelming," you are not merely commenting. You are naming the terrain you will continue to walk through. Again, this is not about pretending. It is about recognizing that naming something fixes its role in your experience. Once you see this, you gain a choice you did not know you had. You can continue to name things unconsciously, or you can begin naming them deliberately. Deliberate naming does not deny what is present, it chooses what is authoritative. There is a difference between acknowledging a moment and defining a pattern, between naming a sensation and naming an identity, between describing a circumstance and declaring a future. Most people collapse all three into one sentence. This is why the spiritual path has always emphasized discernment of speech, not purity, not perfection. Discernment, knowing when a word is simply a sound and when it is a seal. You are not meant to stop speaking. You are meant to stop speaking carelessly, because once you understand the law of naming, you realize that every sentence is either opening reality or closing it, either leaving room for movement or confirming stasis, either loosening a pattern or tightening it. And this is the quiet turning point. Not when life suddenly changes, but when you realize that you have been participating more actively than you thought, not through effort, but through permission, not through willpower, but through language. From this point on, the question is no longer whether words matter. That has already been answered. The question becomes, which words are you willing to continue authorizing? Because what you continue to name, you continue to live inside. And what you choose to rename slowly begins to move. Once you understand that naming sets direction, the next truth reveals itself quietly and unmistakably. Much of what you are living was never consciously chosen. It was agreed to through language that felt harmless at the time. Most vows are not spoken at altars, they are spoken casually, emotionally, repeatedly. They are formed in moments of fatigue, frustration, adaptation, and self-protection. And because they were never announced as vows, they were never questioned as such, they simply became part of the internal landscape. An unseen vow is any sentence you have repeated often enough that reality now treats it as instruction. You can feel this when you hear certain phrases come out of your mouth and they feel old, automatic, heavier than the moment requires. Statements like, "That's just how it is," or "This is who I am," or "I've always been this way." These are not reflections, they are commitments that once served a purpose and were never released. Every unseen vow begins as an attempt to regain stability. The mind names something in order to make sense of it. The body accepts the name as orientation. Over time, the name becomes a rule. This is why vows are powerful, even when they are limiting. They bring order, they create predictability, they reduce uncertainty. And for the nervous system, predictability often feels safer than possibility. So when someone says, "I'm not good at relationships," what they are often really saying is, "I found a way to stop hoping." When someone says, "Money is hard for me," what they are often saying is, "I learned how to survive disappointment." When someone says, "I always end up alone," what they are often doing is sealing a boundary around vulnerability. Reality does not interpret these sentences psychologically. It interprets them structurally. It hears, "This is the pattern to maintain." This is why unseen vows persist even when the desire has changed. The conscious mind wants something new, but the vow is still active. And because it is unnamed as a vow, it is never consciously revoked. In ancient traditions, vows were taken seriously because they were understood as energetic contracts. To vow was to bind oneself to a trajectory. To break a vow required ceremony, witness, and intention. You did not simply stop, you released. Modern language creates vows without ceremony and keeps them without awareness. And this is why people can feel as though they are doing everything right and still feel held in place by something invisible. They are not blocked by lack of effort. They are being held by loyalty to language spoken long ago. And loyalty is powerful. The unseen vow is often reinforced by identity. Not the true self, but the constructed self that learned how to function in a particular environment. The self that adapted, the self that survived, the self that learned what was expected, rewarded, tolerated, or safe. That self learned to speak accordingly. It learned which words kept it accepted, which words avoided conflict, which words lowered expectation, which words made disappointment survivable. Over time, those words formed a map, and that map became familiar, even when it led to places that no longer felt aligned. This is why changing language can feel destabilizing at first. It threatens the map, it introduces unfamiliar terrain, it removes the comfort of knowing what comes next, even if what comes next has never been what you wanted. But this is also where power returns, because an unseen vow loses its hold the moment it is seen as a vow, not judged, not condemned, simply recognized for what it is. A sentence you spoke when you were protecting yourself. A conclusion you reached when you did not yet know another way. A naming that once brought order, but now enforces limitation. You do not need to fight these vows. You do not need to suppress them. You do not need to analyze them endlessly. You need to name them accurately. There is a profound difference between saying "this is who I am" and saying "this is the vow I've been living under." The first closes inquiry. The second opens choice. Once you recognize a phrase as a vow, it becomes negotiable. This is where many people misunderstand spiritual sovereignty. They think it requires force, discipline, or constant vigilance. In truth, it requires honesty at a much quieter level. Honesty about what you have been promising to maintain. Because a vow is not just about what you declare possible. It is about what you declare inevitable. When you say "this always happens," you are not predicting. You are pledging continuity. When you say "I can't change this," you are not assessing difficulty. You are affirming permanence. And reality, which honors continuity, responds by keeping the pattern intact. There is no punishment in this, only fidelity. Reality is faithful to your words. This is why breaking an unseen vow does not begin with new affirmations. It begins with withdrawal of consent. A quiet moment of recognition where you see the vow clearly and acknowledge that it no longer represents who you are becoming. And becoming is the key word here. Unseen vows are static. They lock identity in place. But life is not static. Consciousness is not static. The moment you begin to sense that you are becoming someone new, the old vow begins to feel heavy, constricting, outdated. That discomfort is not resistance. It is misalignment. This is why awareness alone begins to shift things. The moment you hear yourself say a familiar, limiting phrase and something inside you hesitates, you have already loosened the vow. The pattern begins to destabilize because it is no longer fully endorsed. You may notice this happening now. A subtle pause before speaking, a feeling of "that's not quite true anymore," a sense that certain words no longer fit. This is not something to rush. Vows dissolve through recognition, not force. They unravel when they are no longer fed through repetition. And here is the deeper truth beneath this entire movement. You are not meant to live vowelless. You are meant to live consciously vowed, bound not to limitation, but to direction, not to fear, but to alignment, not to who you were, but to who you are allowing yourself to become. Words will always bind. The question is what they bind you to. As this transmission continues, you will not be asked to monitor every sentence. You will be invited to listen for resonance, for the feeling of contraction or expansion that follows your own words. That feeling is guidance. It tells you whether a vow is being reinforced or released. Once you learn to hear that signal, language becomes a living compass, not a rulebook, not a prison, a compass. And this is where the path shifts from unconscious repetition to deliberate direction. Because when unseen vows are brought into awareness, they do not need to be broken. They simply fall away, having served their purpose. What remains is choice, and choice is where creation begins again. Once unseen vows are revealed, something subtle but irreversible happens. You realize that language is not merely something you use, it is something you stand inside, and from that realization, a quiet authority begins to return. Authority does not announce itself loudly, it does not rush, it does not convince, it settles. It feels like alignment rather than effort. And it begins the moment you understand that words are not powerless sounds, but signals of permission. Reality does not ask whether you are confident when you speak. It asks whether you are consistent. This is why authority is not about volume. It is about coherence. When you speak from habit, your words carry history. When you speak from awareness, your words carry direction. And direction is what reality responds to most faithfully. Not because reality is sentient in the way humans imagine, but because coherence always organizes experience. This is where many people misunderstand the idea of creation. They believe creation requires force, or intensity, or certainty beyond doubt. But authority does not require belief. It requires alignment between what is spoken and what is allowed to continue. Authority arises when you stop contradicting yourself. For most people, language is fragmented. One sentence declares desire, the next reinforces limitation. One moment reaches forward, the next pulls back. Reality responds to the net instruction, and the net instruction for many is stasis. This is not a failure of faith, it is a mismatch of speech. When authority is present, language simplifies. There is less explaining, less justification, less emotional excess. Words become fewer, but they land more cleanly. They do not beg reality to change. They assume participation. This is why certain people seem to move through life with ease. Not because their circumstances are lighter, but because their language is not constantly reopening questions that have already been decided. They do not keep renegotiating their own worth, direction, or permission. They have settled into a way of speaking that does not undermine itself. Authority begins internally long before it is visible externally. It begins when you stop using words to manage anxiety and start using them to establish orientation. When speech becomes less about coping and more about choosing, choosing does not mean controlling outcomes. It means choosing the stance from which outcomes are met. This is where the power of simple declarations becomes clear. Not affirmations, not mantras, declarations. A declaration is not a wish, it is a statement of position. It says, "This is where I stand." When you say "I am," you are not describing personality. You are declaring stance. You are choosing how you meet the unfolding moment. And reality responds to stance far more reliably than it responds to hope. This is why declarations must be spoken carefully, not because they are fragile, but because they are formative. What you repeatedly declare becomes the ground you walk on. If you declare yourself overwhelmed, life meets you as something to survive. If you declare yourself capable, life meets you as something to engage. If you declare yourself behind, life appears rushed and unforgiving. If you declare yourself present, life unfolds with more space. These are not metaphors. They are orientations. And orientation determines experience. At this stage, it becomes clear why silence precedes authority in every spiritual tradition. Silence is where contradictory impulses dissolve. Silence is where speech is purified of habit. Silence is where words regain their weight. Authority is not about speaking more, it is about speaking after listening. Listening not to others, but to the subtle response inside when you consider saying something. There is always a signal, a tightening or a loosening, a contraction or an expansion. That signal tells you whether the words you are about to speak reinforce an old vow or align with a new direction. Most people ignore this signal because they are accustomed to filling space. But when you begin honoring it, language slows, speech becomes deliberate, and authority naturally follows. This is the moment where many people feel a strange discomfort, because authority removes excuses. It removes the comfort of blaming circumstances, timing, or other people, not harshly, quietly. It reveals where you have been continuing patterns through permission rather than necessity. And this is not something to judge. Authority is not punitive, it is clarifying. Clarity is the true source of power. Once clarity is present, you begin to see how often your words have been performing emotional labor rather than spiritual direction. How often they were used to soothe fear, deflect responsibility, or soften disappointment. And you begin to understand that none of this was wrong. It was simply a phase that can now complete. Authority does not demand that you never speak vulnerability. It demands that vulnerability not be confused with identity. It allows emotion without turning it into a permanent descriptor. It acknowledges difficulty without granting it sovereignty. This distinction changes everything. You can say, "This feels heavy," without saying, "My life is heavy." You can say, "I am learning," without saying, "I am failing." You can say, "This matters to me," without saying, "I am desperate." Authority lives in these distinctions, and once you begin speaking from this place, reality responds differently. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily. Patterns loosen, resistance softens, opportunities appear that would not have been visible before, not because they were created, but because your stance now allows you to meet them. This is the quiet shift that marks the transition from unconscious participation to conscious authorship. You stop reacting to what appears and start meeting it from a chosen position, and that position is not dominance, it is presence. Presence is the highest authority there is, because presence does not argue with reality, it engages it, it does not demand control, it assumes participation. This is why those who speak with authority rarely explain themselves. They do not need to. Their language is aligned, their words are not compensating for doubt, they are expressing orientation. And orientation is felt. At this point, you may notice something subtle happening. Certain phrases no longer feel available to you, not because they are forbidden, but because they no longer feel true. They carry a weight that does not belong to where you are now standing. This is a sign that authority is integrating. You are not being asked to perfect your speech. You are being invited to inhabit it, because once you inhabit your words, they stop working against you, they begin working with you. And from here, the final shift becomes possible. Not just choosing words differently, but choosing the relationship you have with language itself. That is where sovereignty completes, and that is where we go next. Linguistic sovereignty begins quietly. It does not announce itself as power. It arrives as a subtle shift in how you relate to your own voice. Words stop feeling disposable. Speech stops feeling automatic. You begin to sense that language is not something that happens after experience, but something that participates in shaping it. This awareness does not require effort, it requires presence. To become sovereign in language is not to speak perfectly. It is to speak consciously. It is to recognize that words are not filler for silence nor decoration for thought, but orientation points within experience. Every sentence places you somewhere. Every phrase situates you within a field of meaning. When language becomes conscious, life becomes navigable in a different way. Sovereignty does not mean controlling outcomes. It means choosing stance. It means knowing where you stand as life unfolds. Language is how stance is established, not through force, not through insistence, but through consistency. When your words are aligned, your experience stops pulling in conflicting directions. Most people live without linguistic sovereignty because they speak from reflex. The reflex was learned early. It formed in environments where adaptation mattered more than truth. Words became tools for safety, belonging, and survival. Over time, those tools hardened into habits. Habits turned into identity markers, and identity markers turned into invisible boundaries. Linguistic sovereignty gently dissolves those boundaries by restoring choice. You begin to notice that many phrases you use are not necessary. They are inherited, passed down through family, culture, environment. They once served as navigation tools, but now they operate without intention. When you see this, something relaxes. You are no longer compelled to speak the way you always have. This is where sovereignty differs from discipline. Discipline restricts, sovereignty permits. It allows you to pause, to feel into a word before releasing it, to sense whether a sentence expands your field or narrows it. This sensing is not intellectual, it is embodied. You feel it as openness or contraction, as ease or friction. That sensation is guidance. When you begin to honor that guidance, language reorganizes itself naturally. You speak more slowly, you choose fewer words, you allow silence to do some of the work language used to do. Silence becomes an ally rather than a gap to be filled. In that space, words regain their weight. Weighted words change how reality meets you. Not because reality is persuaded, but because you are no longer sending mixed signals. Your language stops negotiating with itself. It stops opening and closing doors in the same breath. Direction becomes clearer. Movement becomes simpler. Linguistic sovereignty also changes how you listen. When others speak, you hear more than content. You hear orientation. You hear where someone is standing inside their own experience. You hear the boundaries they have named and the permissions they have granted. This does not create judgment, it creates clarity. With clarity comes compassion. You see how often people are living inside sentences they did not consciously choose. You recognize the weight of unseen vowels in their speech. This recognition does not require correction, it requires presence. Sovereignty never imposes, it simply models coherence. As your relationship with language deepens, you may notice that certain words no longer feel available. They are not forbidden, they simply feel inaccurate. They no longer reflect your stance. This is not suppression, it is evolution. Language sheds what no longer fits when identity shifts. This shedding can feel disorienting at first. Old phrases carried familiarity. They provided reference points. Letting them go creates space. Space can feel like uncertainty until it reveals itself as freedom. In that freedom, new language emerges organically, not rehearsed, not forced. True language does not exaggerate, it does not dramatize, it does not diminish. It names with precision. Precision is the signature of sovereignty. When words are precise, reality responds with clarity. When words are vague, reality remains diffuse. This is why sovereignty is not about saying more empowering things. It is about saying truer things. Truth spoken consistently reorganizes experience over time. Not because truth demands change, but because truth removes distortion. Distortion is what keeps patterns looping. When distortion fades, movement becomes possible. You may find that your language begins to reflect process rather than permanence. You speak in ways that allow movement without denying the present. You acknowledge what is without sealing it as final. This subtle distinction alters everything. Life becomes dynamic again. Linguistic sovereignty also restores trust in your own voice, not as authority over others, but as authority within yourself. You stop outsourcing meaning. You stop borrowing language that does not belong to your experience. You begin speaking from where you actually are, not from where you think you should be. This authenticity strengthens coherence. Coherence is felt by others. It does not require explanation. When words align with being, they carry resonance. Resonant language does not convince, it invites, it does not persuade, it reveals. This is why sovereignty is contagious, not because it spreads as an idea, but because it is recognized as presence. People feel it before they understand it. They sense clarity, they sense stability, they sense orientation. These qualities draw response without demand. As this integrates, you may notice a shift in how life unfolds. Situations resolve with less resistance. Decisions feel cleaner, relationships reorganize, not dramatically, gradually, naturally. The environment begins to reflect the clarity you are holding internally. This is not a reward, it is alignment. When language and being are aligned, life stops pushing against you. It meets you, it collaborates, it responds. Linguistic sovereignty is not the end of the path. It is a threshold. It marks the moment where language stops working on you and begins working with you, where words stop reinforcing the past and begin participating in emergence. From this place, something deeper becomes possible. Not just conscious speech, but conscious silence. Not just chosen words, but chosen presence. This is where sovereignty matures into something quieter and more expansive. Everything you have heard up to this point leads here. Not to restraint, not to quiet withdrawal, but to responsibility. Because once you recognize that words are not neutral, there is no returning to unconscious speech. Awareness changes the relationship permanently. From this point forward, language becomes authorship. The power of words is not symbolic, it is directional. What you speak establishes the tone of the path you continue walking. Not dramatically, not instantly, but faithfully. Reality responds to what is named consistently, not what is felt occasionally. And now you understand that every sentence you speak is either maintaining an old orientation or introducing a new one. This is where most teachings stop short. They reveal the mechanism, but they do not hand it back to the individual. Insight without ownership becomes another concept. What completes this message is not silence, but conscious speech. From this point on, your words are no longer reactions, they are positions. You do not need to speak more, you need to speak deliberately, to recognize when language is reinforcing a pattern and when it is opening movement, to notice when a phrase feels familiar but no longer true. That sensation is not confusion, it is recalibration. This is how authorship integrates, not through effort, but through discernment. When you speak from this place, your language stops negotiating with the past. It stops explaining itself. It stops compensating. Your words become clean. They carry direction without force. They do not convince reality. They assume participation. This is the difference between language as habit and language as law. Law does not argue, it establishes. And this is the threshold where you step out of unconscious agreement and into conscious declaration. So before this transmission closes, we anchor it, not with silence, but with a word that marks transition. If you are willing, speak one sentence, once, slowly, with presence. Not to change anything, but to claim orientation. Say, "My words now shape the reality I continue." Say it out loud. Say it without emphasis. Say it as recognition, not intention. This is not a promise. It is not a goal. It is a statement of authorship. From this point forward, you will hear your own speech differently. Certain phrases will no longer feel available. Others will arrive naturally without effort. Language will begin to organize itself around clarity instead of habit. You will notice that reality responds not with spectacle, but with coherence. This is how creation actually works, not through constant declaration, but through consistent alignment, not through intensity, but through precision, not through hoping for a better future, but through speaking from a truer present. If this transmission resonated, it is because you were already sensing that words carry more weight than you were taught to believe. Codex of Light exists for those who are ready to work with that weight consciously. You are welcome to continue with this work here. Subscribing is not about notifications, it is about orientation. From this point on, your language is no longer accidental, it is deliberate. It is directional, it is yours.